Oh, sailor, have you found your perfect sea?
Hi, welcome to what is essentially a set of small lectures about thinking better. And what I want to do in this lecture is say something about who I am, say something about the kind of person I think might gain from listening to this lecture, and also something about the state of the world which leads me to even want to deliver lectures like these. Because in some ways I think if the world were not so crazy, and there is a good case to be made the world is always crazy, let's keep that in mind, but if the world were not so crazy, some of the things that we're going through in this lecture series you wouldn't even need to talk about. So in the first instance, let me say what I want to do in this lecture series, and that is I basically want to identify ideas which, if you don't grasp them, or if you simply take them for granted, which is to say, if you don't predicate what you say upon having answered them in some way, whether explicitly or tacitly, but nevertheless dealt with them, then what you're saying is not worth listening to. And we are surrounded by people today who are talking at you and who are organising our society in such a way that is disastrous, and in better circumstances we wouldn't even bother listening to them. So that's something else that will come out. So in one sense you could say there is a kind of political purpose behind these lectures. Now, let me clarify immediately, I hate ideology. And there's going to be some people who think no matter who you are subject to some ideology or other. If you believe that, either be prepared to change your mind or go away, because it's nonsense. I've heard this nonsense for a long time. I think it just does a tremendous amount of damage and brain damage, and anyone who wants to think independently, think for themselves, recognising, of course, the complexity of the world and how much labour is involved in genuinely thinking or seeing things in this very complicated world we live in, and we do live in a very complicated world, then having someone come along and just sum you up with an ideology, they are your enemy. Don't listen to them. And whether they are telling you because you're a man you must think this, or because you're a woman you must think this, or because you're black you must think this, or a white you must think this, leave them alone. They want to control you and your soul. They want you to be complicit in a narrative that they are developing, and invariably in which they occupy a privileged status in the deliverance of this narrative. So they have a stake in the game. I'm much more interested in people like me who just want to understand what is happening in the world. I became an academic, and let me just backtrack a little bit. I have been teaching I was teaching at universities. I thankfully retired, and I say thankfully because I leave very disillusioned about what universities are doing in the world today, and I think they're actually making the world worse rather than better. That's a very sad thing to have to admit, and I wish I'd had more energy, and I wish I'd been better at doing what I did, but that's the state of the art. In my opinion, universities have very few good people in them anymore, and they are basically places of mass indoctrination. So one of the reasons I'm giving this lecture is, as I said, I taught at a university for a very long time, about 35 years. I was never in a philosophy department. I was always friendly with people in philosophy departments, but I never quite belonged to them. And one of the reasons I didn't belong to them is I was always interested in another set of questions which they really asked, or really asked well, or simply assumed that the answers were pretty easy, and I don't think they thought sufficiently about them. And in those days, doing what I did, which was political theory, which has its own, every discipline has its own problems. It's a bit like a relationship. Every relationship has its own problems. Anybody in a relationship knows, no matter how perfect it is, it's got issues. That is life. Life is one damn thing after another that you've got to deal with. And one of the reasons that I felt never able to get on the philosophical team was that philosophy is just another way of thinking and being in the world. And you can study a pedigree of philosophers. You can go right back to the ancients, and at times in this series of lectures I will talk about some of these people. You can go back to Thales or Xenophanes or Plato or Heraclitus, or you can come up with the moderns, and etc., etc. But each one of them is trying to give you a way into accessing what they think is most important about reality. Now that is great. I love philosophy. But when it becomes a discipline, it's very easy for sets of consensuses to set up about which questions are the all-important questions. And it's these consensuses that simultaneously establish disciplines, which can be very good, but they can also compartmentalize the way you think in a way which can be very destructive, because it creates a kind of wall that prevents you from seeing. And here's a paradox, and throughout this lecture series I'll be talking a lot about paradox, because we are constantly dealing with paradoxes. The paradox that in order to know something I must recognize that I don't know enough, so I want to know more, or if I think I really know a lot about something and I wish to convey it, then I also need to take into account that maybe my knowledge is only partial. And this is a very serious issue in the modern world, where we are surrounded by people, and especially in universities, who I call know-alls. They think they know everything important that is to be known about essential issues. They think they identify what the issues are, and that they know what they are, and they can convey that to you. On the other hand, here's a paradox. If I knew absolutely nothing, then I couldn't know that they didn't know what they're talking about. So we need to know something to know nothing. Now, I don't want to get too entangled in that kind of paradox. I'm just simply making the point that as we develop this discussion or set of lectures or talks, we are going to frequently come up against these paradoxes. I'll come back to the point I was making, and I will wander. That's okay. I think thought wanders. And I think not to understand that is to be mistaken. Thought is not like doing a certain technological puzzle. It's not like you open up a manual and you do A, B, C and D, as you would say if you were doing a logic course. That's simply not the way the world presents itself to us. It presents itself as a set of contingencies, crises, opportunities, trials and tribulations that we have to deal with. It presents itself in all manner of ways, and thought is like that. I do want to introduce at this point my co-worker in this enterprise. His name is Chris Drew, and he might just come and be on camera for just a minute. Chris was a former student of mine.
Hello.
And Chris is a very thoughtful young man who at times will prompt me, edit what I'm saying, ask me questions and confound me and pick me up on when I missay words.
When you waffle too much.
When I waffle too much. Okay. So Chris is intrinsic to this, and I would not have done this lecture series, even though I had intended to do something, had I not come into contact again with Chris, who really summoned me to give this talk. And that's an important idea, concept, way of looking at things, that very often we're summoned to do something. So we are engaged in relationships. And one of the things I will be emphasizing time and time again throughout this set of talks is that ideas are nothing without the people that have them. Ideas do not exist in themselves. Anyone familiar with the philosopher Plato talked about ideas in themselves. Now, I love Plato, and like all the great philosophers, he has many good points, and what he's saying makes a certain kind of sense if you're talking about mathematics or intrinsic structures of things. But most of the ideas that we as human beings are dealing with are not of that order. They're based upon fleeting incidences, contingencies, relationships which we are trying to make sense of. So Chris is going to be my partner in crime in this enterprise. Whether or not he frequently joins me for a discussion, or we're yet to see. Okay, so getting back to a few other things about myself. So I taught at university for a long time. I was at the University of Adelaide. I then went to the University of Hong Kong. I then ended up in Charles Darwin University. I basically taught politics of one sort or another and European studies, primarily intellectual history and history also of institutions. So that was really what my interest was, and my interest in philosophy and in ideas. So the motivation behind this series of talks is that I am concerned about the state, the dire state indeed, of our institutions, and it requires more thoughtful people to try and rectify things. And it may be too late to even rectify things. On the other hand, I do think it's better to be more thoughtful rather than less thoughtful. And I think you owe it to your own soul, to your very self, to have a better idea about what's going on rather than a worse idea about what's going on. And we live in a world, and I suspect by now, if someone is still watching this or has entered into this YouTube talk that I'm giving, or series of talks that I'm giving, what interests them is the state of the world and how they would like to have a certain independent mindedness in approaching it. That doesn't mean that you are the great origin of all thought, that you have to have your own entire philosophy or something like that. That's all nonsense. But if you are dissatisfied with certain narratives that have become predominant, then very often you just want someone else who realizes things are wrong. You just want to feel that you're sane, and you want to communicate with or listen to someone that also can expose them for the nonsense that you know they are. And we are, as I said, surrounded by ideas, which I liken to a kind of dialectic. That's a term that in modern times we trace it back to Immanuel Kant and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. But it's a suggestion of a kind of unity of opposites as they develop. That's the Hegelian notion of that. I might go into that later, but it's not that important. I think the dialectic that we live in today that is predominant is a dialectic of imbecility, and that is ideas which are terrible ideas, which are somehow operating in tandem to develop a certain sense of the way the world is, which happens to ensconce a whole lot of people in positions of power, and especially within universities, but also in any of the ideas-broking institutions. It's working its way into policy, and it's having a huge effect on the way that we are making the world. And as human beings, we are always making the world. Don't forget this. I'm now making a video. You're watching this. One of us had to do something, or all of us had to do something to be here. Not only the making that went into the technology, not only you've come into your room, you're sitting there, you've turned on the light, someone made the lights, I'm talking at a camera, Chris is helping me make this. There's a myriad of makings that have gone on in what is happening right now. Philosophers, unfortunately, and I think it's a real unfortunate set of terms, talk about subjects and objects. I think that's a terrible way to talk, and one of the things that I hope to convey through this set of talks to you is the importance of rethinking the way that we talk about things, not simply taking for granted the adequacy of the names that we use to build our stories, our narratives, our descriptions of the world, but we pause and think about things and think, hang on, that's, a subject, an object. They're terrible words. I tell you, I said earlier that this is talking about politics, and at the same time, I feel I'm not a very political person at all. I want to convey that because I am sure that if there's any kind of audience at all, I will be dismissed as a conservative or an alt-right person. I'm absolutely sure, and that's because at the moment, the position that is dominant in our society, has a pedigree that you can trace to the so-called left, even though there's so many ironies in this, given, for example, that big tech, there's nothing left-wing about, owners of mega capital or big technology. But there's a kind of dialectic of imbecility, craziness that we're caught up in. But because the narrative of oppression and the narrative of identity has become so part of today's compliant requirements to fit into a decent, so-called decent world, a world without hate or whatever. Such nonsense. But anyway, all of these come out of what was originally considered to be the left in terms of its narrative formation. I will be considered to be anti-left because I hate that stuff. It's rubbish from go to woe, and we will go through it. All these little moves that are made that are just terrible. They're really ways of shutting down your mind. And at the end of the day, we don't have much. We are dependent creatures. We are a microbe away from death. We are dependent upon the love that we have received, the friendships that we have, the benefits that we have, the social goods that come our way, the capacities we have if they don't. If we have a very hard life and we have certain capacities, we might end up like Robert Johnson and make great music. Or some of these old, blues guys from the Delta, Lead Belly or everything. So grateful they had those capacities. But their circumstances and the trials of their circumstance also drew out those capacities. So that's something else. We never know what we will do with what's given to us. So the idea that someone is going to create a world which we will never have to deal with trials and tribulations. This is so disgusting. It's despicable. And you want to tear out your brain when you hear this stuff. And if anyone tells it to you, just look upon them with pity if you don't spit in their face. You're basically the choice is there. And here's a nice example of the kind of nonsense that is seen as depth in our world. It was put on Facebook. And a teacher in a class, where else, got students to sit in rows and throw stuff in a little bin that he had put up. And the point was to show that people at the back of the classroom had a more difficult job of getting stuff in the bin than people up the front. So the people up the front were more privileged than the people in the back. No, the slip of that was a very Freudian slip given today's world in which black people are crafted and in a certain way by these ideologues in order to make the ideologues themselves feel so good about themselves because they're going to redeem these people. Despicable. Anyway, I simply want to say, if you're the kind of person that think life is like sitting in a classroom throwing stuff in a bin, then really you're wasting your time watching this lecture because you're so caught up in the dialectic of imbecility, you're unsalvageable at the moment. Hopefully everybody might, grow a brain. But at the moment, that's just ridiculous. The kind of trials and tribulations that each one of us has in our life is ultimately what gives us character. And I will give a lecture about character because in some ways the psychology, which is not something anyone can teach you, so I can't, and there are, certain people on the internet, on the web, YouTube, that are quite good at talking about psychology. And I'm not saying that I'm one of them. In fact, I'm not. That's not what I'm going to be doing. But I will just say this. Your character is going to be the key to what you can and cannot see. And that you have to do in your life. In the choices of your life as they build up over time, as they feed upon each other, feed into each other, as they make who you are, what you are. And sadly, through a life, we all err, we are all ignorant, and this is very much the place I'm coming from. We all know very little, we all mess up. There's a great theological phrase for this, and it's called original sin. And the reason I think that's a great phrase is because it basically is just saying everyone must mess up. There was one person who didn't, and that person was God. And that's good. Whether or not you believe in Christianity or not is less interesting, I think, than the idea that there was one person once who got it all right, and now no one ever will do it, because I've never met anybody that gets everything right. So our error, our capacity for errancy, that is not a bad thing. So I'm not saying, if you don't know much, don't watch these lectures. What I am saying is if you think you know everything, please go away. Because the only way you will learn you don't know everything is through some kind of crisis that is not going to come from watching a YouTube lecture. Maybe a marriage breakdown, the loss of a child, something terrible might happen, and then you'll wake up. We use the term woke today, and I'm one of those people, as you would have gathered by now. I hate the so-called woke ideology. The idea that people are basically sleeping a lot of the time, that's true. We do sleepwalk through life, that's true. And in fact, all of us, for maybe 95% of our life, are pretty well asleep. It's just the people that think they're awake aren't awake. They are in a total deep sleep nightmare. And this is, I'll come back again to why I'm giving these lectures. I realised some time ago that we all know this. I think we all know this, but it's the kind of thing people forget. Human beings are basically in one of three states. We're either going in, being in, or coming out of hell. And I belong to the generation whose parents lived in hell. We were very lucky, and those people that were children in the 60s, 70s, 80s, in the main, obviously this isn't true for everybody, but in the main, it was a very creative generation in which ideas and all sorts of rules and regulations were overthrown. It was a kind of playtime. It was a youth revolution, and that wasn't just in the West, by the way, that was quite global. And the youth revolution was a kind of throwing off the chains of heaviness, the burdens of the previous generation. And this was a very real thing and a very understandable thing, because it was a tragic, horrible time that our parents lived in. My own grandfather, for example, my father's father, went to a concentration camp in Australia for Italians because he simply was Italian. The family was broken by this. He died shortly after coming out of that camp. This is a sad thing. The war caused that sad thing. And then my generation, we thought everything was possible. And unfortunately what has happened is, as we have come out and we had this period of great play, certain frivolity, including around sexual relationships and the huge amount of destruction to the bricks and mortar of social reproduction that is the family. And I'm not a moralist, by the way. I'm not setting myself up as any kind of moral paragon. I'm much as part of this problem as anybody else. But ultimately what we have done is created a world in which the generation now of younger people is heading into a terrible place. And the way that people who deal in ideas and now run our institutions are trying to deal with this, is trying to dictate how they think, what they should say. It's not only what you must say, you could say any society of manners. There's certain things you say you don't say. But to dictate how one thinks is to take someone's soul away. So we are creating a very soulless world. So I am one of those who thinks that Western civilization is at a crisis stage. It is true that civilizations are always in crisis stage, and had we lived in 1930, 36 or 37 and seen what was happening with the Nazis, or seen what was happening with the communists, they seem to get a very good run from it from North American intellectuals who know nothing or don't seem to know very much about that. Or even in 1913, 1912 and not seen. So we're always in a period of crisis. We're always really going into hell. The one difference is this time, though, is that it's very likely that Western people will become an enslaved people. And that's whether, if you want that, that's fine. Whether you don't think that's a problem, that's fine. If you think only a white supremacist would worry about, well, you think that, okay. But if you think that there are better ways to make a world, there's better ways to participate in the world, and they start with a certain humble yet independence of mind, humble in knowing that you need to know more, not just being a smarty pants. Independence of mind meaning not just accepting what people say without giving it consideration, without thinking, without going through the pros and cons and having the wherewithal to know when it is that you need to consider the pros and cons. If you think those things, then hopefully this set of talks might be useful to you. I'm certainly one of those who spent my life being perplexed by things, and it's taken me a very long period of time to reach the point I want to reach. Before I conclude, I'm going to wrap this up. I do want to say about politics. I said I don't see myself as very political, but I inevitably will be considered alt-right or something nonsense like this. And the reason is this. I think politics is a very limited means of action. Politics basically involves orchestrating human energy through fiat, through dictate. And how you decide who has the authority to organise people and who can back that up with force, there's various ways you can do that. Democracy is one way of doing that. Republican democracy is a variant on that way. I think our democracies are in serious danger. Democracies, by the way, have never had a very long history. And for exactly the same kind of reason, they haven't had a long history as what we're experiencing today. Nevertheless, I think it is a better rather than a worse way to do business. So, also when I think about politics, the usual way of talking about left wing and right wing really had to do with what one thought about markets, private property. I want to say the state because that's the truth, though very often people on the left spoke as if they weren't really about the state. They were simply about human solidarity on a very vast scale. This was typical abstract talk of the sort that does nobody any good because it was a lie. And we knew it was a lie because when human beings organise themselves, it's not just spontaneous once it's on any large scale. So when it comes to building stuff, they're either going to go into a factory and work because of one or two reasons. One is someone's forcing them to do it, or economic necessity forces them to do it. And so when we come to the old words of left and right about state versus capital, as I said, forget the anarchists and all that. That's just absolute rubbish. If you believe it, again, believe it. And the chances are that someone who's been to a university is more likely to believe this because they're capable of great abstraction. But the question you've got to ask yourself there is, what kind of activities do people spontaneously do on a large scale? And for how long? And the answer is actually very little. It's all sorts of requirements, necessities and benefits which accrue to people, make them do things together. So if people want to think about left and right in terms of state versus markets, I would just say from the outset, that's a very technical question. States do some things, markets do some things. They developed in tandem, that is, the state, the modern state and the modern market system developed in tandem. They're inextricably related. So those conservatives that simply say that, you know, the state is a bad thing, well, I think that's nonsense. Those people who simply say, radicals who simply say the market is a bad thing, I think that's nonsense. Just wrapping this up, Chris and I are doing this lecture series. This one was a kind of overall view, bit of a rant, saying a little bit about myself, a little bit about the motivation behind it. It's possible that if you come into the lecture series, if anyone does come into it, but if you come into the lecture series and you want to know some more about me, you'll hit this video. It's most likely that you've come to something else before this. I'm putting out however many there'll be, 20 or so of this series, of this talk. They're not in order. You don't need one to understand the other, because when we think, as I said, we just think. So I'll be looking at the kind of insights that you cannot overlook, but which are easily overlooked. The kind of, if you like, bullshit indicators that you should be looking for, and things also to improve your, you know, you just want to think with some independence. So there's certain kind of questions you should always consider, and not just take them for granted. And I'll be talking about them in forthcoming lectures. Thank you very much.